They didn't expect him to speak. Why would they? The vote was already scheduled, the redevelopment plan all but locked in. The city council chamber hummed with quiet certainty, the kind of certainty that comes when everyone thinks the decision's been made. Developers in the front row flipped through glossy renderings of what the new downtown would look like: sleek, modern, and, to the untrained eye, flawless. Council members leaned back in their leather chairs, eyes skimming the agenda, mentally skipping ahead to the line that read, "Vote approved." In the public seating area, David Brooks sat quietly, his white cane resting across his lap. He didn't look like a man about to challenge a multi-million-dollar project, at least not to them. The last time he'd been in this chamber, he'd been a guest at someone else's presentation, ushered politely to the back row, thanked for coming, and then ignored. Tonight, his name wasn't even on the official speakers list. It had been scribbled in the margin at the last possible moment. A courtesy, not an expectation. But when the council chair cleared his throat and said, "Mr. David Brooks, you have the floor," the quiet in the room changed. Not respectful quiet, the other kind. The kind that tilts toward skepticism, as if the room is bracing itself for something awkward, something forgettable. David stood, feeling the weight of that silence pressing in. He straightened his blazer, his left hand gripping the cane just tightly enough to feel the smooth curve of its handle. And then, without hesitation, he began the slow walk toward the podium. He didn't open a laptop. He didn't shuffle a stack of notes. He didn't glance at the color-coded blueprints spread across the table in front of the council. Instead, he laid one palm on the edge of the wood and spoke into the microphone like a man who already knew every street, every corner, every step of the city they were about to change. David Brooks had been an architect long before anyone called him disabled. 2 decades of his life were measured in lines and angles, in the satisfying scratch of pencil on vellum, in the weight of models heavy with the promise of buildings yet to rise. He designed libraries that smelled faintly of fresh paint and paperbacks, schools where sunlight flooded hallways just right, and parks that seemed to invite people to sit a little longer than they'd planned. He didn't just draw walls. He imagined how people would move inside them, how a child might race around a corner without tripping, how a grandmother's hands would rest on the railing as she climbed a set of steps. Then came the year the world blurred. At first, it was just the edges, street signs hazy in the distance, words on a page that seemed to fade before he could finish reading them. The diagnosis was swift and blunt: advanced glaucoma. Surgery could slow it, but not stop it. Within a year, his world narrowed to shadows and light, and then finally to darkness. For a while, David thought his career might survive the change. Architecture was more than sight. It was math, memory, problem solving. He trained himself to read tactile blueprints, raised line diagrams that let him trace walls and corridors with his fingertips. He learned to build 3D models that could be explored like miniature cities in his hands. And he carried a mental map of every project he'd ever worked on, as vivid in his mind as if he could still see them. But the industry didn't see it that way. Clients hesitated, colleagues tiptoed around the subject. One partner at his firm, trying to be kind, suggested he focus on consulting instead of design. David recognized the subtext: "We don't think you can do the real work anymore." When the city announced its sweeping downtown redevelopment plan, David followed the details like a man reading the fate of his own neighborhood. The glossy concept art was everywhere: posters at bus stops, mock ups in the newspaper, all promising sleek high rises, widened roads, and revitalized public spaces. But no one seemed to notice what wasn't in the pictures: the curb ramps that made crossings safe, the textured paving that warned of intersections, the generous sidewalk widths that allowed wheelchair users and parents with strollers to pass each other without a struggle. David applied to be on the city's review committee. He submitted a detailed proposal emphasizing accessibility from the earliest design stages. The reply came in a short email: "Thank you for your interest. We have selected other candidates." He wasn't surprised. In city planning circles, he was no longer David Brooks, award-winning architect. He was David Brooks, the blind consultant. And when people don't expect you to see, they often forget to ask what you notice. 2 weeks before the final city council vote, David's phone buzzed late in the evening. The caller ID showed a familiar name: Elena, a junior planner in the city's Department of Urban Development. Her voice came through fast, urgent, with that slightly shaky quality people get when they're both angry and afraid. "They've changed the plans," she said without preamble. "Cut the curb ramps, narrowed the sidewalks, moved the bus stops further from intersections. All of it." David stilled, gripping the phone tighter. "They can't," he said. "They already agreed on universal access standards." "That was before the developers stepped in," she replied. "They say it's about maximizing retail frontage and streamlining costs." Her voice dropped lower. "But we both know what it really means. They want the renderings to look clean. Accessibility features don't photograph well." David exhaled slowly, his mind racing through the tactile blueprints he'd studied of downtown. He could already picture, no, feel, the new hazards. A wheelchair user trapped at a curb with no ramp. A blind pedestrian stepping into a bike lane with no tactile warning strip. Parents with strollers forced into the street because the sidewalks were too narrow. "Elena," he said quietly, "send me the updated plans." There was a pause. "You won't be able to," she began, then stopped herself. She knew better than to finish that sentence. "I'll send them," she said instead. By morning, the plans arrived, delivered in 2 forms: digital files he couldn't use and a set of raised line prints on thick paper. He spread them across his kitchen table, fingers gliding over every ridge, every curve, every interruption in the once seamless routes. The changes were deliberate. Corners that had once opened into wide, safe spaces now funneled into sharp bottlenecks. Transit stops were pushed so far back that anyone with limited mobility would struggle to reach them. It wasn't just oversight, it was erasure. That night, Elena called again. "They're voting in less than 2 weeks," she said. "Public comment is technically closed, but there's still the open mic section before the vote. If you can get on the list." David didn't hesitate. "I'll get on it." "David, the room's going to be full of people who think this is already done," she warned. "They won't be expecting you." He smiled faintly. "That's the point." Over the next several days, he built his argument, not on aesthetics, not on abstract policy, but on lived experience. Every sidewalk measurement was paired with a story of someone who used it. Every cut in the plan was a cut to a person's independence. By the time the council vote rolled around, he wasn't just ready to speak. He was ready to make them see the city the way he navigated it every day from the ground up. The night of the vote, City Hall looked less like a civic building and more like a battleground. The marble floors echoed with the shuffle of polished shoes and the low hum of voices, each carrying a side of the argument. Developers in tailored suits gathered in tight knots near the front, their briefcases leaning against expensive leather chairs. Community advocates filled the gallery seats, clutching folders stuffed with petitions and protest signs rolled under their arms. David arrived with his cane in one hand and a folded stack of tactile notes in the other. The air smelled faintly of coffee and photocopied paper, nerves and bureaucracy mixing into something strangely metallic. Every sound painted a picture in his mind: the sharp click of high heels crossing the chamber floor, the rustle of papers as council members shuffled the agenda, the faint thump of a gavel being tested for the session. He made his way to the public seating, feeling the subtle change in air pressure when the room turned to watch him pass. People didn't stare out of cruelty. They stared because they didn't expect to see him here. A blind architect walking straight into the most high-stakes meeting of the year. Up at the front, the city council dais rose above the floor like a judge's bench, its arc lined with microphones, nameplates, and glasses of water, half filled and sweating under the lights. Behind the council members, glossy posters of the redevelopment plan were mounted on easels, the kind of images meant to sell a dream. Smooth pavement, gleaming storefronts, no sign of the grit or humanity that made the real streets feel alive. The gavel fell. The chair called the meeting to order, his voice amplified and official, the kind of tone that usually signaled a foregone conclusion. After an hour of procedural updates and budget readings, they reached the vote. Before moving forward, the chair cleared his throat. "We have one final speaker before the decision, Mr. David Brooks." A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. Some shifted in their seats. One developer coughed, almost in amusement, and somewhere in the back, Elena sat with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, waiting. David rose. Each step toward the podium tapped out a rhythm on the marble, steady, deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't bow his head, didn't act like a man who'd been added to the list as an afterthought. When he reached the front, he laid one palm on the edge of the wooden lectern, feeling its grain under his fingertips. The microphone caught the faint creak of his blazer as he straightened his shoulders. And then, without glancing at the renderings behind him, or needing to, he began. "This," he said, "is not just a redevelopment plan. It's a decision about who gets to belong in this city and who gets pushed out." David could feel the weight of the room pressing back against his words. When you can't see faces, you learn to read other signs. The shuffle of papers when people are tuning out, the faint squeak of a chair as someone leans back in disinterest, the pen tapping against a folder when they think they've already heard enough. And he was hearing all of it. Halfway through his statement, one council member began scribbling notes to the person beside her. On the developer's bench, someone let out a sharp, quiet exhale, a stifled laugh maybe, or the sound of patience wearing thin. David's fingers tightened slightly on the lectern. For a split second, a thought tried to slip in. They've already decided. You're wasting your breath. But he pushed it aside. He'd walked into enough rooms like this to know there was always a way to change the temperature. You just had to make the air heavier with something people couldn't ignore. He shifted his approach. No more policy jargon, no more measurements. I want to tell you about a boy, he began, his voice slowing. He lived in my neighborhood. He was in a wheelchair, and for years he couldn't go anywhere alone, not even to the library, because every street corner trapped him. The room quieted. You see, the curbs had no ramps. His mother had to lift the chair over every single one. Then, 10 years ago, the city installed ramps. Not because of a vote or a committee, but because a group of kids petitioned for it. David paused, letting the silence hang. That boy rolled up to me one day, grinning so wide I could hear it in his voice. He said, "I went to the library by myself today." He let the image settle over the chamber. "This redevelopment plan erases that," he said finally. "It puts him back where he started, and it tells every person like him, we didn't think about you." He didn't need to see the council members to know something had shifted. The pen tapping had stopped. The faint rustle of paper had gone still. When you've been ignored long enough, you can hear the exact moment someone starts listening. He closed with a simple challenge. Look at these plans, not as lines and labels, but as streets you'll walk when you're older, as sidewalks your kids will use, as bus stops your parents will try to reach when it's raining. If it's not safe for them, it's not safe for anyone. He stepped back from the mic, the soft thud of his cane against the floor marking the end. The room held its breath. Then came the sound, not applause, but the sharp, synchronized drop of pens onto desks. One council member stood, then another, until every seat on the dais was empty and every member was on their feet. It wasn't sight that told David he'd won. It was the shift in the air, the way the room now leaned toward him instead of away, and the quiet understanding that they couldn't vote the same way they'd planned to when the night began. The redevelopment plan passed, but not the version David had walked in to fight. Every curb ramp was restored. Sidewalk widths were increased beyond the original dimensions. Tactile paving strips were added at intersections where they'd never existed before. Bus stops were repositioned for easier access. For the first time in years, the city wasn't just checking boxes on accessibility requirements. It was building with inclusion in mind from the ground up. Word of the meeting spread quickly through professional circles. Architects he hadn't heard from in years called to congratulate him. Some admitted they'd never thought about certain design features until his speech forced them to picture using the city without them. One developer, one of the very people who had pushed to remove the features, asked David to consult on a new mixed-use complex, not as a token hire, but as the lead accessibility designer. But the ripples didn't stop at professional respect. 2 weeks after the vote, David received a handwritten letter. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places, but he recognized the name instantly. It was from that boy in the wheelchair, now a college student. "I heard what you said about me at City Hall," the letter read. "I still remember the day I went to the library by myself. And I want you to know I'm studying urban planning now because I want to be the one making sure no one else gets left out of a map." David read the letter twice. He traced the words with his fingertips as if the ink itself carried weight. That night, he took a walk through downtown. It was noisy, the rumble of buses, the hiss of street lights, the low bass of passing cars. But in his mind, he could already hear something else. The sound of cane tips tapping safely across newly paved ramps. The roll and hum of wheelchair tires moving without obstruction the easy, unhurried steps of people who didn't have to think twice about the ground beneath them. He still couldn't see the city, but for the first time in a long time, he could feel that it was beginning to look more like the one he'd been carrying in his mind all along. Some victories happen in grand unveilings, ribbons cut, cameras flashing, applause echoing off tall walls. Others happen quietly, in the slow redraw of a map, in the steady reshaping of streets, in decisions made by people who will never get credit, but whose work changes how others move through the world. David's fight wasn't about lines on a blueprint. It was about who those lines include and who gets erased when they're redrawn without thought. He proved you don't need to see a city to know when it's being built wrong. You just need the vision to imagine it right, and the courage to speak until others can picture it too. So if this story made you think about the streets you walk, the doors you open, or the places you've never noticed because they've always been easy for you to reach, share it. Because somewhere, someone is navigating a world that wasn't designed with them in mind, and your voice, your willingness to pass this story on, might be the thing that finally gets them written back into the plan.